Hello, I'm Bill McNally. Welcome to America's Future. My guest today is Mr. Hal Shurtleff. He is the field director for the John Birch Society. He lives in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. Welcome, Mr. Shurtleff, to Windham, New Hampshire.
Well, Bill, thank you for having me on this beautiful January day. And I hope that the viewers don't hold against me the fact that I'm from Massachusetts.
Right. You know, I guess the first question to start off is, what exactly is the John Birch Society?
Well, that's a great question. And again, I could spend hours answering that question, but I won't. We only have a half an hour. And there's a lot of folks out there that have heard the wrong things about us, some negative information, or they have misconceptions of the organization. But what we are basically is a volunteer organization, primarily made up of volunteers. Our major function is to restore our Constitution and to educate and inform the American people about some fundamental things: the proper role of government, our marvelous Constitution, our marvelous heritage we have. And the fact is that we're losing it, and losing it very quickly, to a group of people that we term the insiders. And but we're of the opinion that if enough Americans became sufficiently informed and took their citizenship seriously, that we'd be able to reverse this and restore our great country.
You hear people say that you're a political organization, but you're not. You don't run anybody for office, and
No.
you don't support anybody.
No, the organization it's chartered by Massachusetts general laws as a not-for-profit educational organization. And when you say educational, you think of schools, or you might think of books and things of that nature. Well, that's in a sense that's correct. We're a university without walls. We don't have, people will sometimes say, what do you do? And I'll say, well, I'm a coordinator or a field rep. Well, what's that? And I'd say, are you an educator? I said, well, I am. And we do have a summer camp program where we do have formal classes.
Right.
I said, but our educational is a little more informal. In fact, our job isn't so much to educate people, it's to help people educate themselves.
Well, first, give us a little background. I have a couple books here, The Life of John Birch and the Blue Book, but give us the background on the society, its starting, and who started it.
Okay, well, it was a man named Robert Welch, and some of the viewers may have, if they were my age, or your age, or older, they might remember the Welch's Fudge Bar, which was a nice little candy bar that used to cost a nickel. Robert Welch was in the candy business, and to give you some background...
I heard that he invented the Sugar Daddy.
And he's all, yeah, which is still
right?
on the market, I believe, the Sugar Daddy,
okay.
yeah. Robert Welch was a genius, in my opinion. He learned how to read at the age of 2. He was born in 1899 in North Carolina, and by the age of 2 he was learning how to read. And by the age of 7 he was reading a 9-volume history of the world, which I have a copy of, all 9 volumes. And man, that's heavy reading for, I think, for most people. And he graduated from high school at the age of 12, on to college at the age of 16, went on to Harvard. We're talking now right around the World War I era. After he left Harvard, he went to Harvard Law School and locked horns with a well-known socialist, person who became a well-known socialist, Felix Frankfurter. Started a candy business and was very successful with that. And it was in the 30s when he realized that the United States was heading into socialism in a big way during the Franklin Roosevelt administration. But it wasn't until after World War II that he realized he had to do something more about it than just talk about it and read and write. In 1958, well, actually, what I should say is he wrote a little book in 1954 called The Life of John Birch. And this was a story of how a young man, a young missionary to China, who was just a dynamic individual. He had became an Army intelligence officer after he rescued the Doolittle's crew from the famous Doolittle bombing mission over Tokyo. And of course, a lot of folks today, kids don't learn that in history anymore, so they don't know who Colonel Doolittle is, but it was a famous mission it was shortly after Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And it didn't accomplish a big military objective, but it was a big morale booster.
Right.
And Birch rescued them he was behind enemy lines.
But at that time he was a civilian, he was a Reverend
He was
John
working
Birch.
as a missionary.
Missionary,
correct.
right.
And he was only in his early 20s. But anyway, he rescued Doolittle, and at that point he decided to go into the military, intelligence officer. And after the formal end of the war, 1945, in September, late September, he was brutally murdered by the Chinese communists as he was on a mission for the United States Army. And his death was hushed up. Well, Robert Welch had access. Robert Welch was very politically astute and involved, and he was friendly with some U.S. senators, one particular one from California, William Nolan, he had access to the Senate Library and came across the story of young John Birch and how he was murdered. He was very motivated and inspired by this young man. He said that he was the first victim of the Cold War, or World War III at the time. So the little book he wrote was quite an expose on not just the life of John Birch, but some of the treachery that went behind it. He also wrote a book about the same type called May God Forgive Us, about how our State Department betrayed the Chinese to the communists. And that book got a pretty good circulation. And a lot of people have back then claimed that it had a lot to do with the election and how the Democrats were voted out, as if that doesn't always make a big difference anymore. But to say that our job isn't to vote anybody out, our job is to inform people, because we're not political. But anyway, and Robert Welch had a magazine, which we don't have in front of us,
Yeah,
or do we?
Yeah. Well, you mean the original one?
Yeah, the original. He came out with a magazine. He wrote his own magazine, and then it
Yeah.
became American Opinion, and now it's called the New
Now it's
American
called the New
magazine,
American.
which
I'm
but
sure
in
this
some
issue
libraries,
here on one of your campaigns, right, to save the
Save
Panama
the Canal. Yes, that's right. We have a lot of special issues. Anyway, but Robert Welch realized that magazines were good to have and books were good to have, but without a grassroots organization, organizing local members at the congressional level. Now, it is not that our goal is to get Democrats or Republicans or Libertarians elected, but it's to create understanding in those congressional districts. So in 1958, in December, he got together some of his friends and colleagues in the business community and in the manufacturing community, and I guess there aren't that many left anymore in the manufacturing community, unfortunately. And he gave a 2-day dissertation in a home of a friend of his in Indiana, and that became the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, which we still make available. And in the book, he pointed out some of the problems we were facing, and that if these things weren't reversed, we probably wouldn't be a free people anymore. He made a track record of the advance that the communists had made. Now, of course, you think Cold War communism, but these communists were taking country after country, and he just did the mathematical progression or geometric progression. They keep on doing it, there won't be many free countries left. And Robert Welch was successful in organizing this organization, and it is my opinion that had he not done this, we probably would have lost our freedoms already.
What was he saying about Castro, like, say, around 1958?
In 1958, Robert Welch called Fidel Castro a communist, and he said that he had been one all of his adult life since his college days, and it wasn't a secret. And it was, in fact, it was an ambassador to Cuba, E.T. Smith, who discovered that a little bit too late that he was a communist. In fact, Eisenhower said in the early 60s, after Fidel Castro made his communism known and he invited Khrushchev to Cuba and what have you, he said if anyone who knew Castro was a communist before he mentioned that he was a prophet and a genius. Well, I guess Robert Welch was a prophet and a genius in the eyes of Eisenhower. So, in fact, one of the things, Robert Welch had wrote a book called The Politician. He wrote this book. It actually was a letter, a very long letter, that he sent to some people, and he said, look, don't publish it, don't reproduce it, read it, let me have your thoughts. It was very critical of Eisenhower, not just as president, but his career, his military career, from a colonel to a general in almost no time at all, which is almost unprecedented in the military U.S. history. And some of the real disastrous things that Eisenhower was doing. And he made 3 conclusions. He said he's either one of the 3. Make your own opinion. And so he said he's either stupid, he's either a willing opportunist, or he's a conscious and articulate instrument of the communist conspiracy. And people read that, the wrong kind of people read that and said, oh, he's calling Eisenhower a communist. And we still hear that today. Oh, the John Birch Society calls Eisenhower. We call everybody you don't agree with a communist. Well, that's baloney. And in fact, there are a lot of people that probably take that as a compliment. But anyway, the Birch Society never took that position, but you still hear this misinformed perspective sometimes.
Let's get into some of the campaigns that you've been involved in here, or the Birch Society. I had one here called Save Our Canal. We won't spend too much time on it.
Well, we'd like to focus on successful campaigns. Right. Although, let me mention this, but when the canal was being transferred, the treaty back in the late 70s under Jimmy Carter,
right.
A number of those U.S. senators that signed on to this treaty, because a treaty has to be approved by senators, U.S. senators, a lot of them lost the election the following election cycle. And although they didn't stop the canal, there was a lot of backlash over that. And of course, what happened was during the early 90s, we had to send our troops in there. And today, the Chinese military, an arm of well, it was Hutchinson Whampoa, which is sort of a subdivision of the Chinese military. They now run the canal. So we were right back then not to turn it over, and it looked at instability there and the fact that both sides of the canal are now administered by an arm of the Chinese military, basically.
Let's go to this one here. This one is an action plan to impeach Clinton now.
Well, that was a fun time to be involved with the John Birch Society.
But that had nothing to do with this Monica Lewinsky, right?
No, in fact, the John Birch Society's local members in Massachusetts, in Lexington, Massachusetts, we had a speech that was done by John McManus, who is the president.
This one here?
Why impeach Clinton?
Oh, yeah.
And it was aired on C-SPAN. It was probably a good month before the Lewinsky issue broke.
Okay.
In fact, they aired it January 1st, and the Lewinsky broke, I think, about 3 or 4 weeks later. And our contention was that Clinton was guilty of bribery and perhaps treason because of his policies towards Communist China. He had been critical of Bush, George Bush, the father Bush, his treatment of China after the Tiananmen Square issue massacre, that it was business as usual, and he was critical of that, and he ended up doing the same thing. And in fact, he was sending high technology he was getting money from Chinese officials, from Chinese politicians, and American Chinese people as well. And
you did a special issue
that's right,
in the New American called Chinagate, Treason in the White House.
That's right. So unfortunately, the Lewinsky issue broke a little after that our campaign was launched. And while we can't prove it, we think that the Lewinsky took the pressure off the real reasons. Now, should he be impeached for what he did with Lewinsky? Oh, absolutely. But it wasn't as vitally important as treason and bribery,
right.
Because you take an oath to uphold the Constitution, and I think if you can't uphold your marriage vow, then you might have trouble upholding your oath of office. So even though he was not removed from office, he was impeached. He spent a whole year defending his miserable presidency, which meant he couldn't get his agenda through, and he really had trouble getting out. We heard the term gridlock. Oh, gridlock. Amen to gridlock. We wish we had more of it. That was the way the Constitution was supposed to be designed. The Constitution wasn't supposed to give any particular branch a blank check on the power. And so gridlock is generally a good thing if it means bad legislation won't get passed. And it also taught a lot of people about the Constitution. A lot of people had no idea what impeachment meant, what the process was, and people were reading the Constitutions. And when they read the part about impeachment, they sometimes read other parts too. It's not just that one thing now.
All right, let's go. We had a guest, or I had a guest on the show not too long ago, Mr. James Perloff. He was here talking on evolution. We mentioned his book, The Shadows of Power.
And you don't have a copy of it to show anybody, huh?
No, I don't. Well, we have it right here on the pamphlet.
Okay.
Yeah. In other words, the book that's rocking the establishment. And it seems like there's two organizations in the world that are rocking the establishment: the John Birch Society and what's the other one? The Council on Foreign Relations.
Oh, I see. Or rocking. Oh, I see. Rocking the world. I see. Well, that was another very.
So tell us about that book.
Well, we published this book in 1988,
Yeah.
and publishing a book is good, but not what you do with a good book. You got to get people reading it, right?
There you go.
And for some reason, the New York Times does not review our books. We've actually had one book on the New York Times bestseller list back in the 70s.
Which one was that?
It was a book exposing the Chappaquiddick incident. Teddy Bear, it was called.
Yeah.
But it wasn't because I wanted to, but because the book sells. I guess sometimes they have to put the stuff on there that's selling. Anyway, this book was, and what made the book particularly interesting is it wasn't written by some stuffed shirt political science professor. It was a man who had, as you had been on a show, he had been a member of or supporter of the far left, but he had a complete change of heart and change of mind in his positions. But the members of the John Birch Society just didn't say, here's a book, let's read it, because now we'll know more. But we were very aggressive about getting this book out in a lot of hands of people, opinion molders, for example. We mailed copies of this book to every single state legislator in the country, 10,000 or so, and many other type of opinion molders. And I tell people that because of what we did in 88 and 89 with the state legislators, that made it possible for us to defeat something very dangerous that came around in 1995 called the Conference of the States, which we don't have the time to go into right now, but it was a bold proposal to rewrite our Constitution. And New Hampshire was the first state that shot it down, actually. But because of the relationships we had built with a lot of state legislators, when they got the book, they were interested in learning more. And I know, for example, in Rhode Island, it was a state legislator. He had been a former state, he had been out, but he had still a lot of influence. And it was his influence that was used to squash this issue in Rhode Island.
So and I noticed here, I brought us just a few of the videos you have. One is called Immigration Invasion by Jack McManus.
Well, Bill, like any good educational and action organization, we're going to produce books and videos and magazines. And, of course, from the 16 millimeters now to the DVDs.
Yeah.
And we've got some recent ones on the immigration issue, on probably we think is our most important campaign, the opposition to the North American Union. But we're not just a group that's opposing things. We are promoting things too. And we promote the concepts of real capitalism, not this corporate managed capitalism where certain companies have status, or where the legislature and Congress give special permission or status to certain countries like China, and along with that all types of foreign aid. Or if you're an American company and you're going to set up shop in China, the government will say, look, you can go over there, and if anything happens, we'll cover the bill. You can't open up a shop in China and do that, but if you have the right connections, you can. That's not free market capitalism, and that's not has nothing to do with what they call free trade as well. That's a perversion of free trade.
You might want to brief us. Let's see. Jack McManus was here talking specifically about the free trade areas of the Americas.
Right.
It would appear that has been put on a back burner, but now there's a new issue called the North American Union. What's going on here?
Well, the FTAA was an attempt. It was launched right after the NAFTA was passed in '93. But in 2002, George Bush spoke to sort of a closed-door function. And he said that this free trade area of the Americas will happen by January of '05. It will be a done deal by then. And we're working with Congress. Every time he says we're working with Congress, it basically means they're buying votes from them if they can. And this will happen. He was so confident. And what's interesting is when you hear Bush give a speech, if you ask a question to Bush off the cuff, what's your position on abortion? What's your position on homosexuals marrying each other? He hems and haws, is very uncomfortable. But when it comes to globalism, he doesn't relent. It's going to happen. It's a done deal. There's no turning back, that type of attitude. Well, it didn't happen. South American countries, FTAA was going to be basically a political and economic merger of North and South America. Mm-hmm. And we launched a major campaign in early '04, and we think that we got a lot of people to understand what this was about. Most people had no idea that was happening. And right now it's, as you said, on the back burner. But these folks don't just say, oh, well, we give up, let's go home and watch football. They may watch football, but they're busy during the rest of the week. And they've launched these things called the North American Union, the Security and Prosperity Partnership. They're also in the planning stages. In fact, they're supposed to be breaking ground with this NAFTA superhighway. That's going from Texas, from Mexico all the way to Canada through the heartland with numerous branches.
And I understand it's going to have what do they call it, a port